Montana Territory, January 1884. The snow was high enough to swallow a boot hole when Nadine Voss stumbled into the open field, one glove missing, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. She did not remember how long she had been walking, only that the wind had taken her sense of direction and the sun was bleeding out behind the mountains. She was alone. Again. Her fingers clutched the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it had not kept her warm hours ago. Her skirts were soaked through, the hem frozen stiff. Her steps slowed, legs shaking. The field stretched too wide, too white. No trees for shelter, just the wind and snow and silence. Nadine's legs gave out without warning, and she dropped to her knees with a soft gasp. The breath came out of her in smoke. She blinked, dizzy, trying to focus on something, anything past the blur of white. Then she saw him. He was on horseback, riding along the tree line. A large dark figure against the snow, moving slow and sure. He had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind, a thick coat dusted with snow, and behind him a bay horse pulling a sled stacked with chopped wood. She tried to stand, to wave, but her arms barely lifted. Her voice cracked on her lips. The rider spotted her anyway. He pulled the reins and turned sharply toward her, riding hard. When he reached her, he was off the horse before it fully stopped. "Ma'am?" His voice was deep, warm, and full of concern. His eyes, pale gray like storm clouds, looked her over fast. "Can you hear me?" She nodded weakly. Without another word, he bent and lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing. His coat smelled of pine and horses. Her frozen fingers curled into his collar. "You are frozen through," he said, his voice close to her ear. "We need to get you warm." He carried her to the sled, wrapped her in a buffalo hide, and climbed up beside her. The horse turned back toward the trees, and soon a cabin came into view just beyond the ridge. The fire was already going when he carried her inside. She barely registered the soft sound of the door shutting behind them or the way the wind died as soon as they stepped in. Her body shook uncontrollably, but his arms stayed around her until he had her close to the hearth, kneeling beside her as he pulled off her boots and peeled away the wet skirts. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said firmly, looking her in the eyes. "I am just trying to keep you alive." She blinked at him, lips trembling. "I know," she whispered. He wrapped her in wool blankets and rubbed her hands briskly. "You got a name?" "Nadine," she said, barely louder than a breath. "Nadine Voss." His hand paused in the motion. "Yates Callahan," he said after a beat. "This is my land." "You wandered into my east field." "I didn't mean to," she murmured. I was just trying to find the tracks again. Lost them in the storm." "You came from the rail?" he asked. She nodded again. "Where were you headed?" She hesitated, then gave up the last of her pride. "Anywhere. Just not back." Yates nodded like he understood more than she had said. He stood and moved to the stove, pouring hot water into a tin cup before returning and placing it in her hands. "You drink this. Then tell me what happened." She drank, her hands barely able to hold the cup steady. "My husband died last spring," she said eventually. "We had nothing left. I took work in a boarding house in Billings, but the owner was." She swallowed. "Not decent." Yates's jaw tightened. "I left with what I could carry. Thought maybe I'd find work on one of the ranches. I followed the rail lines for a while, but then the storm rolled in and I couldn't see where I was going." "You should be dead," he said softly. "You would have been if I had not gone out today." "I know," she whispered. Yates stood, moving to the small kitchen table. He pulled off his gloves, then his coat, revealing a thick flannel shirt and strong shoulders. He moved slow, careful, like nothing ever rushed him. "You are staying here tonight," he said. "No discussion." Nadine opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She was too tired to fight, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something like safety. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked at her, eyes softening. "You do not owe me anything. You needed help. I helped." Later that night, she woke to the sound of wind scratching at the shutters. The fire had burned low. She sat up slowly, her body sore and scabbed with cold. Yates was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, watching the storm. "You should sleep," she said. He turned. "Could not. Storm's bad." She hesitated. "You were out there when you found me." He nodded. "Had to check the fence line." Something told me to go earlier than usual. She looked at him a long moment. It was not just luck. You saved me. Yates stood and crossed to her, kneeling again by the hearth. His hand reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. I am just glad I got there in time. His hand lingered a breath too long. She did not move away. Silence settled between them, thick and warm despite the wind outside. I do not have anywhere to go, she said, voice steady now. He looked at her, really looked. Then stay. For now. Until we figure out what comes next. She nodded, heart-thudding. Thank you, she said again. He gave a small smile. You are safe here, Nadine. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The next morning, the light came slow and pale through the frost-laced windows. Nadine sat on the edge of the cot Yates had made up near the stove. Her fingers curled around a dry biscuit he said he'd baked 2 days earlier. It was hard but warm, and it filled her belly better than anything had in weeks. Yates was outside splitting wood. From the window, she watched his steady rhythm, the clean arc of the axe, the simple strength in it. He didn't glance toward the cabin once, but she sensed he knew she was watching. Her hands still ached from the cold, but the pain was duller now. She stood slowly and crossed to the hearth, adding a stick to the fire like he'd shown her before heading out. The flames caught easily. She took it as a small triumph. When he came in, the wind tugged at the door behind him until he shoved it shut with his boot. He took off his hat and coat without looking at her, as if he didn't want to press. I patched your glove, he said, setting it on the table. Leather was soft enough still. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. You didn't have to. I had the thread out already. He set a kettle on the stove. Figured you'd want both hands working. She slipped it on. The stitching was tight and straight. I do. He poured water into 2 tin mugs and added coffee grounds from a cloth sack. The smell was bitter and rich. She held the cup in both hands, letting the steam rise into her face. You got any folk anywhere? He asked, not looking at her. No, his eyes lifted to hers. None at all. They're buried in Missouri. Diphtheria took the last of them before I turned 17. He nodded once, like he understood what couldn't be fixed. You've been on your own a long while then. She didn't answer and he didn't push. Instead, he motioned toward a bench near the back wall, stacked with mended tools and folded burlap. I could use a hand sharpening blades if you're up to it. She nodded and followed him over. He handed her a whetstone and a dull skinning knife. Keep the angle shallow, he said, sitting beside her. Let the stone do the work. For a while, they worked without speaking. The scrape of metal against stone filled the space between them. It was quiet, but not uncomfortable. After a time, she asked, how long have you lived out here? Going on 6 winters. He didn't elaborate, so she didn't ask why. Instead, she said, I always thought Montana was just mountains and snow. He gave a small breath of amusement. It's that. And a little more. What do you like about it? He paused, then said, no one expects anything but honesty. Makes it easier to breathe. She nodded slowly. I think I came looking for that. Even if I didn't know it. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the wind had quieted. The kind of stillness that follows a storm had settled in. Yates set down his blade. You can stay through the thaw if you want. There's always work here. And I don't mind company that doesn't fill the air just to hear themselves talk. Her hands slowed. She looked at him, measured and careful. I wouldn't take charity. I didn't offer any. You'd earn your place. I could help with the animals. They'll need tending come spring. She set her knife aside. Then I'll stay. For now. He stood and moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. There's a clearing east of the barn. Birch trees and a creek under the snow. We can walk there this afternoon if you've got the strength for it. She watched him, the line of his shoulders, the quiet invitation in his voice. I've got enough, she said. I'd like that. He nodded once and stepped outside. She sat there a long while, the whetstone cool in her hands, wondering how something so simple could feel like a beginning. By late afternoon, the sky had softened to a pale porcelain blue and the wind had stilled into the hush that follows a hardstorm. Nadine stepped outside wrapped in a wool coat Yates had found in a trunk beneath his bed. It hung loose on her frame, but it was warm, and it smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Yates waited near the corner of the cabin, his gait easy as he led her toward the birch clearing. He carried no axe, no rifle, just a small tin of dried apple slices and 2 folded blankets slung over his shoulder. The snow crunched beneath their boots, but nothing else stirred. The horses watched them from the paddock, ears flicking, breath rising in clouds. Nadine glanced once toward the barn, its slanted roof thick with snow, but said nothing. "You steady?" Yates asked, his tone light. She nodded. "My legs feel better today." He gave a slight nod and slowed his pace. The trail was narrow, winding through knee-high drifts and brittle underbrush. Nadine followed closely, her breath measured. She didn't ask where they were headed. She trusted him to lead. They reached the clearing just beyond a small rise. The birches stood tall and bare, their white bark ghost pale against the snow. At the edge, the frozen creek ran silent beneath a sheet of ice, its surface marbled with trapped air and pale blue ridges. Yates spread one of the blankets over a flat stone near the water's edge. He gestured for her to sit, then handed her the tin of apples and took his place beside her, wrapping the second blanket over both their shoulders. "I come here most days," he said after a while, "even in winter." Nadine turned the tin in her hands. "Why?" "Place stays quiet. Makes it easier to think." He picked up a bit of ice and let it melt between his fingers. "When I first built the cabin, I thought I'd only stay through the season. Then another year passed. And another." "You never wanted to leave?" she asked. "Some folks carry their restlessness on the outside," he said. "Mine's always been quieter. It don't ask for much." She took a bite of apple. It was leathery and sweet, sun-dried, the flavor lingering. "I used to think I'd see every state before I turned 30. You still might." She glanced at him. "I don't know if I want to anymore." He didn't answer right away. The creek made no sound, but she could feel the water moving beneath the ice, constant and unseen. "I was married once," he said finally. "Her name was Liza. She died in childbirth." Nadine watched his face. He didn't look away. "I'm sorry. I built the cabin with her in mind," he said. "Figured we'd have a whole life out here." She said nothing, letting the quiet hold space for what couldn't be changed. After some time, she said, "I was born in a sod house outside Independence. I used to sleep on a straw mattress with my sisters lined up like fence posts. There was a cotton curtain between the stove and the rest of the room, and when I was little, I thought it was fancy." Yates smiled faintly. "Sounds like you had good people." "I did." They sat for a long while without speaking. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. Nadine pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned back just slightly, enough that their arms touched. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. The stillness between them wasn't empty. It was full of something slow-moving and solid, something neither of them dared name yet. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked. He looked at her, the fading light catching in his eyes. "Not today." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They walked back as the sky turned violet. The air had cooled again, but the wind didn't bite like before. When they reached the cabin, he held the door open and let her pass into the warmth ahead of him. That night, she sat at the window with her sewing in her lap, mending a tear in one of his work shirts. He moved quietly behind her, stacking fresh kindling near the stove. Neither spoke, but when she held the shirt up to the lamplight and nodded once, he met her eyes with something steady and sure. She folded the shirt carefully and set it aside. "You'll have it back by morning," she said. He leaned his shoulder against the wall, arms crossed. "You've got a good hand for mending. I had a lot of practice." He didn't look away when he said, "You belong here more than you know." She felt it then, not as a sudden thing, but as something that had been growing quietly since she first stepped through his door. She belonged, and he wanted her to. She rose, her feet bare against the wood floor, and crossed to the stove. She knelt, added a piece of wood, and closed the iron door with care. When she turned, he was still watching her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She crossed the room and placed the folded shirt in his hands. Neither of them moved. Then he said, "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time, she believed it without doubt. The morning thaw came slow, dripping from the eaves in steady rhythm. Nadine was at the wash basin, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands working through a shirt collar stiff with old sweat and soil. The water had cooled, but she didn't mind the sting. The act gave her something to shape with her hands, something that answered to her care. Yates stepped in through the back door, boots damp from the melt and hair darker at the temples from his hat. He set down a bucket of ash, brushing his palms on his trousers. "There's a cow due soon," he said, glancing toward the barn. "She's heavy and slow this morning." "I can look in on her," Nadine offered. "If you show me what to watch for." He gave a short nod. "You'd know once you saw. She'll get restless first. Then she'll lie down and try to rise again." She dried her hands and reached for her shawl. "You ever had trouble with a calving?" "Once," he said. "First year I was here. Lost the calf. The cow made it, but she wouldn't eat for days after." They walked to the barn together, their steps soft in the wet snow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and animal warmth. The cow in question stood apart from the others, her flanks shifting restlessly. Yates knelt beside her, running a hand along her belly. "Not today," he murmured. "But soon." Nadine watched him, the quiet way he moved, the steadiness in his hands. "You're gentle with them." He looked up. "I don't see much use in being rough with something that's already doing its best." She rested her hand on the stall rail. "That's a rare thing." He stood, brushing hay from his knees. "Not so rare as you'd think. Just quieter than most." They stepped back into the light. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of damp pine and thawing earth. Yates paused by the fence, gaze distant. "Used to be a mining camp down by the river," he said. "Before the gold dried up. Just stoves and timber now. I ride through sometimes. Makes a man think on when to hold and when to leave." "You thinking of leaving?" Nadine asked. He shook his head. "No, just remembering what it felt like to wonder." She looked out over the land-rolling hills, a thin line of smoke from the chimney, the quiet sprawl of space where no one watched or asked. "I wondered plenty. Never figured I'd land somewhere that didn't expect anything from me but truth." Yates turned toward her, face unreadable for a moment. Then he said, "You've got a way of seeing what matters." "I had to," she said. There wasn't time for anything else. That evening, Nadine set a stew on the stove using dried beans and a bit of salt pork Yates had tucked away. She stood stirring, watching the way the broth thickened. Yates was at the table, carving a handle for a broken drawer. His hands moved with quiet purpose, knife gliding in slow arcs. When she placed a bowl in front of him, he looked up. "You made this without asking," he said. "I trusted you'd let me." He leaned back slightly, studying her. "You're not afraid to claim space." She sat across from him. "I've been invisible too long." "I see you," he said. She didn't glance away. "I see you, too." They ate without hurry, the fire crackling behind them. When the last spoonful was gone, Yates set his bowl aside and watched the flames. "My mother was a schoolteacher," he said. "Taught me to read before I could ride. She must have been proud." "I think so. She died before I finished building here." He paused. "I wish she could have met you." Nadine felt the words settle between them. Nothing quick, nothing borrowed. Just real and whole. "I'd have liked her," she said. Yates stood, crossed to the hearth and added a log. The light flared, casting golden arcs across the floor. He turned back, his expression open in a way that asked nothing but offered everything. "You're not passing through anymore, are you?" She rose slowly. "Not unless you ask me to." "I wouldn't," he said. They stood in the firelight, the quiet pressing close around them, not heavy but full. Nadine reached out, took his hand. "Then I'll stay." His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer now, like something had turned for good. The days stretched longer. By March, the sun leaning warmer across the fields and coaxing meltwater down from the hills. Nadine had taken to rising just after first light, before the birds began their low calls from the birches. She'd pull on her boots, wrap a scarf around her neck, and walk the fence line with Yates, who always waited by the door with 2 mugs of coffee and a piece of jerky for the dog that had started following her from the barn each morning. They didn't speak much on those walks. The quiet suited them. But there was a rhythm to the way they moved now, a shared pace, a knowing glance when a fence post leaned too far or a paw print meant a fox had passed through in the night. One afternoon, while Yates was oiling the saddle leathers outside, Nadine stood in the doorway with a stack of folded linens in her arms. "You ever think about building on?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes steady. He set the tin of oil down on the railing. "You mean more space?" "I mean something with a window that faces the creek. And a door that doesn't let in the snow under the sill." She shifted the weight of the linens. "Maybe a second room. 4. Whatever comes next." Yates wiped his hands on a cloth, then came to stand beside her. "You see a future here, then?" he asked. "I see one with you in it," she said plainly. "That's enough for me to start planning." He looked down at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes softening. "I've got lumber stacked behind the lean-to. Been seasoning since last fall." "You were already thinking about it," she said, a quiet smile playing at her mouth. "I was waiting to be sure. Are you now?" He reached out, cupped her cheek with the back of his hand, and nodded once. "I am." That night, they sat on the porch after supper, the stars clear overhead, the last of the snowmelt trickling through the grass at the edge of the yard. The dog who Nadine had started calling Thistle lay curled at their feet. "I never thought I'd live somewhere long enough to know the shape of the sky this well," Nadine said, her voice low. Yates reached over and took her hand, callous fingers closing around hers. "You always had the shape of it in you. Just needed the right place to match it." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath slowing in time with his. "What would you say," he began, "if I asked you to marry me come summer?" "I'd ask what took you so long," she said. They didn't rush. Spring came slow and steady, each day warming the earth a little more. Nadine planted herbs in a raised bed near the cabin, and Yates built a new door with hinges that didn't creak in the wind. The cow birthed a healthy calf in April, and Thistle took to watching it like a sentry. In late June, under a sky the color of river glass, they stood in the clearing by the creek, just the 2 of them, with the birches in full leaf and the sound of bees in the grass. Yates wore a clean shirt and a leather string around his wrist that Nadine had braided from scraps of wool. Nadine wore a dress she'd sewn from an old curtain, the seams neat and strong. "I don't have much to offer," he said, his voice steady, "but I'll give you all I've got every day I wake." "I don't want much," she said, "just a place to be known and someone to build with." He took her hands, and they stood there for a long time, the vows simple and spoken without ornament. That night, they returned to the cabin not as 2 people sharing space, but as something built together. Nadine set the new quilt on their bed, one she'd made from scraps found in old trunks and fabric traded at the river outpost. Yates lit the lantern and set it low, the light flickering along the walls. They lay down side by side, the window open to the sound of frogs in the grass and the smell of honeysuckle drifting in. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, and she turned to face him. "We're safe now," she whispered. He kissed her brow. "We're more than that. We're home." Years passed, slow and full. They added a room with a view of the creek, just as she'd wanted, where she kept a rocking chair and a shelf of books they read aloud on cold evenings. Yates built a cradle when her belly rounded in the 2nd year, and when their daughter was born, he cried quietly into Nadine's shoulder and told her the world had never seemed so whole. They named her Clara after Nadine's youngest sister, and she grew up with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet way. In time, Nadine taught reading to the children from the nearest homesteads, and Yates took to carving small animals from scrap pine for Clara's pockets. Thistle aged with a slow dignity, and when his time came, they buried him beneath the birches. They never left the land. They never needed to. And every evening, when the sun settled low behind the ridge, Nadine and Yates stood hand in hand at the edge of the field and watched the light stretch across the earth they had made their own. Not as a refuge or a hiding place, but as a life honest, hard-earned, and theirs.